What if, the most comforting stories you were ever told were actually encrypted warnings?
Right, like warnings about deep-seated corruption.
Exactly, because we're always taught that a good teacher uses metaphors to build a bridge,
Yeah.
right? Like a bridge to understanding.
Yeah, to make things simpler.
Right. A warm loaf of bread, baking in an oven, or a shady tree growing in a garden. These are supposed to be helpful little bridges that connect these really complex spiritual ideas to our everyday reality.
They make the hard truths easier to swallow.
Yeah, exactly. But today, we are looking at a text that argues that master teacher used metaphors not to build a bridge, but to, well, build a wall.
Which is a pretty wild concept to wrap your head around.
It really is. So welcome back to the Deep Dive. If you are joining us today, you already know we absolutely love chasing down those massive aha moments,
Oh, the best kind.
right? The kind of insights that completely overturn your assumptions and make you look at the world with fresh eyes. And today, we have a really fascinating mission.
We really do.
We are looking at a document titled The Mustard Seed by Pastor Fidel Rangel. And it unpacks the famous parables of the kingdom found in the biblical book of Matthew, specifically chapter 13.
And just to set the stage right off the bat here, our goal today isn't to take theological sides.
Right, not at all.
We aren't here to tell you what to believe about these texts. We're simply examining the author's textual argument.
Which is super compelling on its own.
It really is. It's a brilliant look at how, stripping away centuries of modern assumptions can change everything. If you view these ancient stories strictly through the cultural and historical lens of their original first-century audience.
It completely reverses the meaning of texts we thought we understood perfectly.
Exactly. It's essentially a literary and historical decoding exercise.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because Pastor Rangel argues that things we often view as deeply positive symbols in these parables, like a woman baking bread or a giant tree sheltering birds.
Yeah, the classic Sunday school imagery.
Right. He argues they might actually be highly coded ancient warnings about structural corruption and evil.
Which just sounds so counterintuitive at first.
It does. And it all starts with a rather glaring physical anomaly right there in the dirt of the Middle East. We need to talk about the biological reality of the mustard plant.
Yeah, so in Matthew 13, Jesus tells a parable to this really large crowd. He says a man plants a tiny mustard seed, and it grows into the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree.
Right, so big that the birds of the air come and make their nests in its branches.
Exactly. Now, for centuries, the popular surface-level interpretation has been that this represents the beautiful, expansive growth of the church.
Like it starts small, like a tiny seed.
And grows into this massive, sheltering presence, providing comfort to the entire world.
But Rangel points out a massive problem with that reading. And it's a purely biological one.
It's just bad botany.
Right. If you walk along the dirt roadsides in Israel today, or really anywhere in that region, you will see these continuous clusters of mustard plants. They have these bright yellow flowers.
But they aren't trees.
Not at all. They grow as bushes. They only stand about 3 to 4 feet tall. They're just agricultural shrubs.
Right. A standard mustard plant does not have sweeping wooden branches.
No.
Structurally speaking, a bird cannot build a heavy nest in a 3-foot herbaceous shrub. The branches would literally snap.
Yeah, and even if they didn't snap, a bird wouldn't be safe from ground predators down there anyway. It just doesn't work.
It makes no sense.
It's like planting a standard tomato seed in your backyard and watching it grow into a giant California redwood.
Yeah, you would immediately know something was wrong.
Exactly. It just doesn't make sense. And the original first-century agricultural audience would have known that instantly.
Because these were farmers, laborers.
Right. They would have heard the story and thought, wait a minute, mustard plants don't do that. That is an unnatural mutation.
Which is a huge red flag.
Huge. But this brings up a major point of friction for me. Even if it is a mutation, isn't providing shelter for birds a universally good thing?
You would think so, yeah.
I mean, in an intense desert culture, shade is life. So how does Rangel justify turning a giant shade tree into something sinister? Like, why would a master teacher make the illustrations so weird and contradictory?
Well, that is the pivotal question of the entire document, and Rangel answers it by pointing directly to the surrounding context.
Specifically verses 10 through 17 in that same chapter, right?
Exactly. Jesus' own disciples are actually confused by the story, too. They pull him aside in private and ask, "Why do you speak to the people in parables?"
And the answer provided in the text is kind of shocking.
It really is. He explicitly states that His intention was not to reveal the truth to the masses, it was to actively conceal it.
Right. It's essentially a first-century ZIP file.
I love that analogy.
Yeah, like to the vast crowd listening on the beach. It just looks like a quirky, slightly confusing story about farming.
But to the disciples, who are given the decryption key in private,
It unzips into a highly specific, prophetic timeline.
that is a perfect way to look at it. The author explains that the parables were designed as a cipher. They were meant to hide the truth from the religious elites.
Pharisees, right?
Yeah, the Pharisees and unbelievers, all while preserving these mysteries for his disciples and the future church. What's fascinating here is how this plays out structurally in the text.
Oh, the structure is wild.
Jesus presents 7 prophetic illustrations in Matthew 13. And the first 2 parables, the sower and the wheat and tares, they present very little difficulty for the reader.
Because he actually explains them.
Right. Jesus takes the disciples aside and explains exactly what every single symbol means. He hands them the legend for the map.
But the remaining 5 parables, he leaves them totally unexplained.
Just zero explanation.
Yeah, he drops these bizarre, contradictory stories and just walks away. And Rangel argues that because we have the key from the first 2 stories, we're supposed to decode the rest ourselves.
Which is brilliant.
It is. And the deeper you look into these 5 unexplained parables, the more unsettling they become. So if Jesus is intentionally coding a warning about the church becoming a bloated, mutated monstrosity.
How does the corruption actually get inside the structure?
Exactly. That's the puzzle Rangel tackles next.
Yeah.
And it revolves around a really common baking ingredient, verse 33.
Right, the parable of the leaven. It's incredibly brief, literally just a single verse. It says, "The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that a woman took and hid in 3 measures of flour until the whole batch was leavened."
And again, we run into the popular modern interpretation here. I've heard this taught my whole life as this heartwarming prediction that the church, like yeast and dough, will eventually expand and, convert the entire world.
Yeah, it sounds beautiful.
It does. It's a cozy domestic kitchen scene.
But Rangel completely flips this on its head. He demands we look at it through the eyes of a first-century Jewish rabbi speaking to Jewish disciples.
Which changes the context completely.
Absolutely, because to that specific audience, leaven, which we just call yeast, is almost universally a symbol of sin, corruption, or false doctrine.
Because biologically speaking, leaven is an agent of fermentation and decay.
Exactly. It decays the grain.
And Rachel points out exactly why leaven is used as the ultimate biblical symbol for sin. It's because it corrupts specifically by puffing up.
It inflates the dough with gas.
Right. And he traces that all the way back to the concept of original sin, the pride of Lucifer in the book of Isaiah, chapter 14. God detests pride, and leaven is basically the culinary embodiment of getting puffed up.
Yeah, and Jesus himself later warns his disciples to, quote, "Beware the leaven of the Pharisees."
He's explicitly referring to their hypocritical teachings.
Right. Furthermore, the Apostle Paul uses the exact same metaphor in his letters. He writes to the Corinthians to purge out the old leaven of malice and wickedness.
Oh, and think about the central Jewish observance, the Feast of Passover.
Oh, that's a perfect example.
Right. The absolute emphasis of Passover is on sweeping the house clean of any leavened bread. To remove the leaven is to conceptually remove the sin from the home.
So if you think about it, a woman taking leaven and intentionally hiding it in the flour—
It isn't a story of glorious global conversion.
not at all.
Yeah.
It's a terrifying prediction of corruption secretly entering the system.
Now, I have to push back here for a second,
Go for it.
because there's a specific detail in Rangel's own text that caught my eye. He mentions the Israelite Feast of Pentecost,
Ah, yes.
which biblical scholars widely understand to symbolize the birth of the Christian church. But that feast actually is the only major feast that strictly includes leavened bread in its wave offering.
That's right.
So doesn't that contradict the idea that leaven is always bad? If the feast representing the church requires leaven, maybe the parable is a positive thing after all.
Well, you're hitting on a really brilliant theological tension there. And Rangel addresses this directly using the book of Leviticus, chapter 23.
Okay, what does he say?
Yes, the Pentecost wave offering requires 2 loaves of bread baked with leaven. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, it doesn't mean leaven is suddenly a symbol of righteousness.
So what does it mean?
It signifies that the church, unlike Christ, is not perfectly sinless. It inherently contains the presence of human sin.
Leaven.
Yes, the leaven. The church is made of fallen, imperfect people. However, The true horror for the original audience listening to Jesus' parable hinges on the specific target of that
You
leaven.
mean the 3 measures of flour?
Notice that phrase, 3 measures of flour.
I read that and just assumed it was like a standard ancient recipe size, like saying a cup of sugar or something.
Right, but it is so much more than a recipe. That phrase traces all the way back to the book of Genesis, chapter 18.
Oh, with Abraham.
Exactly. Abraham is sitting by his tent in the heat of the day, and he's visited by 3 figures, the Lord and 2 angels.
Right, and in the ancient Near East, desert hospitality is literally a matter of life and death.
Yes. So to honor the divine, Abraham rushes to his wife Sarah and asks her to prepare, you guessed it, 3 measures of fine flour to make bread.
Wow, and importantly, because they were in a rush, this was unleavened bread. So it was completely pure.
From that moment on in Genesis, throughout Jewish and even Arab cultures, 3 measures of flour became the ultimate cultural emblem of pure communion. It meant ultimate hospitality, brotherhood with the divine.
A sacred benchmark.
It is a sacred benchmark of fellowship.
So,
Yeah.
you're saying that when Jesus tells a crowd of first-century Jews that a woman is taking leaven, this universal symbol of pride, decay, and corruption.
And intentionally injecting it into the sacred 3 measures of flour.
Man, that changes everything.
The original listeners would have been left gaping in horror. It's like someone taking the ultimate symbol of purity and intentionally poisoning the well.
And the text states that she hides it until the whole batch is leavened.
The corruption eventually permeates the entire system. Rangel notes that interpreting this as the church joyfully converting the world actually contradicts several other biblical prophecies.
Prophecies that say the world gets worse, right?
Right, which suggests the spiritual climate of the world will get much worse, not better, before the end. The parable is a stark, hidden warning about false doctrine being secretly baked into the very heart of the church's communion.
That completely shatters the cozy kitchen scene. It's literally an act of spiritual sabotage.
It really is.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because we move from a story about internal, hidden corruption to a story about extraction. We're looking at the pearl of great price.
Found in verses 45 and 46.
Right. A merchant is looking for fine pearls, finds one of great value, sells everything he has, and buys it.
Once again, on the surface, it sounds lovely.
A simple story about valuing the kingdom of heaven above all your earthly possessions.
But Rangel highlights the massive cultural shock hidden in the text. Jesus is using explicitly Gentile imagery here.
Right, because to a strict Jewish audience, oysters were considered unclean animals.
According to the dietary laws in Deuteronomy 14, they didn't eat them, they couldn't touch them, and they generally did not trade in pearls.
So for a Jewish rabbi to use an unclean object from the sea as the ultimate symbol of value, that's incredibly jarring.
Consider the biological mechanism of a pearl that Rangel draws out. A pearl is highly unique among precious stones.
Because it's organic, right?
Exactly. You cut a diamond, you polish gold, but a pearl is the only gem that is the product of a living organism. And how does it grow?
It grows specifically in response to an irritation or a wound.
Right. A grain of sand or a parasite gets inside the murky, unclean shell of the oyster. And to protect itself, the organism secretes nacre, coating the irritant over and over again.
It is value born from suffering.
And Rangel argues that this pearl represents the church itself.
Think about the parallels there. The church is a living entity formed in a place of uncleanness.
The Gentile, non-Jewish world?
Right. And it grows over time slowly through irritation, persecution, and suffering.
And what happens to a pearl when it is finally finished growing? It is physically removed from its place of growth.
Talk that out.
Rangel likens this extraction to the theological concept of the rapture. The pearl is taken out of the murky waters of the world to become an object of adornment for the merchant who purchased it at an ultimate cost.
Wow. And that perfectly aligns with what the Apostle Paul says later in the book of Ephesians.
So?
Paul writes that the very concept of the church, this new body made up of both Jews and Gentiles, was a mystery completely hidden from the Old Testament prophets.
Oh, that's a great point.
Right. It wasn't in the original Jewish texts.
Yeah.
So Jesus using this bizarre, unclean Gentile gem that grows from a wound is actually the absolute perfect symbol for a mystery that was completely hidden from the Old Covenant.
It's an incredibly tight literary and theological argument. The parables aren't just random ethical lessons.
Yeah, they're slowly sketching out a prophetic timeline of the church age.
And that timeline brings us right back to the unresolved botanical mystery from our first segment.
The mustard tree.
We need to look at the giant mustard tree again, but this time with these decoded symbols in hand.
Right, because now we've established the cipher. We know the leaven means hidden corruption injected into communion,
Yep.
and the pearl means a completely new entity extracted from the Gentile world. So we go back to the 4-foot mustard bush that unnaturally mutated into a massive timber tree.
We know it's a biological anomaly.
But what about the birds? Jesus specifically said the tree grew so large that the birds of the air made their nests in its branches.
Well, in biblical typology, birds are rarely a good omen, and we have to ask why. What is the mechanism of a bird in an ancient agricultural society?
They are the enemy of the farmer.
Exactly. They swoop down from the air, which ancient cosmology often associated with spiritual realms, and they steal the seed before it can take root.
That makes total sense.
Rangel points to Jeremiah and Revelation, where birds typify foul, evil spirits. But, we don't even have to look outside of Matthew 13 to find the exact definition.
Because Jesus defines them in the very first parable of the chapter.
Precisely. In the parable of the sower, birds come and eat the seeds that fall along the hard path. And when Jesus decodes that story in verse 19, he explicitly identifies the birds.
What does he say?
He says, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown.
Oh, wow. The birds are the evil one, the ministers of Satan.
So put the pieces of the cipher together. The mustard plant was supposed to be a small, humble bush.
But instead, it undergoes this unnatural, monstrous growth into a massive, towering structure.
And who finds refuge in the branches of this monstrosity?
The birds.
The evil spirits, the ministers of corruption.
The mustard tree isn't a beautiful sanctuary at all. It's a stronghold.
It really is.
Rangel is saying that this parable hints at a dark vision where the church would grow into something it was never intended to be. It becomes this massive, bloated structure.
He even uses the phrase, mega churches with false doctrines.
Where the very agents of corruption find a comfortable, shaded place to live and operate.
It's a devastating institutional critique, coded right into a simple farming story.
So what does this all mean? Like, why should someone listening to a deep dive today care about the exact definition of first-century leaven or the nesting habits of birds in a Galilean mustard bush?
It teaches the modern reader the vital importance of critical thinking and demanding historical context.
Right, because context is everything.
If you just accept the surface-level, nice interpretation of these stories, you might find yourself celebrating the very things the text is trying to warn you about.
Yeah, if you think the unnatural mustard tree is the goal, you might actively participate in building a monstrosity that houses corruption.
Exactly. If you think leaven is just a baking metaphor for numerical growth, you might welcome false doctrine right into the center of your community.
It's a masterclass in why we must read texts through the eyes of the people they were written for, rather than projecting our modern assumptions backward.
Absolutely.
And just to prove that these hidden meanings aren't just, random acts of overanalysis, Rangel takes us to the macro level.
This is where it gets really mathematical.
It does. He pulls back to show that this cipher isn't isolated to one chapter. It is all part of a grand, highly coordinated mathematical and literary design across the entire New Testament.
This is where the structural design of the biblical text really comes into focus. Rangel points out a very specific recurring phrase Jesus uses in Matthew 13. He who has ears to hear, let him hear.
It's a clear signal that there is a hidden frequency, right? Like a deeper layer you need to tune into.
A literal call to decode the message. And this raises an important question. Where else does Jesus use this exact same phrase to signal a prophetic timeline?
Oh, I know this one. It appears prominently in the book of Revelation.
Specifically in chapters 2 and 3, which contain the 7 letters dictated to the 7 churches of Asia Minor.
Right.
Rangel argues these 2 chapters are some of the most practical in the entire book of Revelation, laying out the historical epochs and struggles of the church.
Wait, I'm looking at the numbers here, and this is where the math gets genuinely spooky. We have 7 parables of the kingdom in Matthew 13.
Yes.
We have 7 letters to the 7 churches in Revelation. So Rangel lays them side by side. He looks at the 4th parable in Matthew. That's the one with a woman taking the leaven and corrupting the 3 measures of flour.
Right.
Then he looks at the 4th letter in Revelation and what's in it. The 4th letter introduces a woman specifically referred to as Jezebel, who is bringing false doctrine and corruption into the church.
The parallels are undeniably striking.
It gets better. He maps the 6th parable, the pearl of great price. We just discussed how the pearl is extracted, removed from its place of suffering in the unclean waters to become an adornment.
Yeah.
He maps that to the 6th letter in Revelation, The sixth letter is to the Church of Philadelphia, and it contains the explicit promise that the church will be kept from the hour of trial.
A removal, the rapture. Parable 4 matches letter 4 perfectly. Parable 6 matches letter 6 perfectly. The 7 parables in Matthew run entirely parallel to the prophetic timeline of the 7 churches in Revelation.
It's just too exact.
And Rangel adds one final structural cherry on top regarding the writings of the Apostle Paul.
Okay, let me see if I have the math right on this one. Paul authored 13 epistles, or letters, in the New Testament.
Right, 13 total.
But if you break them down by recipient, it changes the count. 3 of those are double epistles. He wrote a first and second letter to the Corinthians, the Thessalonians, and to Timothy.
So if you group those multiples together, that drops the number down to 10 distinct recipients.
Exactly 10.
But look closer at who those 10 recipients are. 3 of those letters were written to individual pastors.
Timothy, Titus, and Philemon.
Right. They were personal correspondence, not written to whole church congregations.
So, when you subtract those 3 pastoral letters from the 10 recipients,
You are left with exactly 7 churches.
7 churches.
Paul writes to 7 churches. Jesus dictates letters to 7 churches in Revelation. Jesus tells 7 parables about the church in Matthew 13.
Wow.
Rangel essentially asks the reader, is this a massive, sprawling coincidence across multiple authors and decades? Or is it evidence of an incredibly precise divine architectural design underlying the text?
It really makes you realize how entirely we miss the depth of these ancient documents when we just skim them for a quick inspirational quote to start our day.
We miss the entire foundation.
Looking through the cultural lens of a first-century Jewish audience completely changes the landscape. It turns quaint stories of domestic baking and roadside gardening to these intense, high-stakes prophetic warnings.
Warnings about structural corruption, demonic influence, and hidden mysteries spanning across centuries.
It reminds us that true learning, true understanding, requires us to look past the comfortable, widely accepted summaries. We have to be willing to ask the hard questions, push back against our own assumptions, and really dig into the dirt of the original context.
And that leaves us with a final thought to mull over, something that extends far beyond just these biblical parables.
What's that?
If these ancient stories were originally designed to act as a cultural cipher, to actively conceal the truth from the masses of their own time, while delivering a hidden warning to those who possessed the code,
Right.
what other historical texts or even familiar stories in our modern world are we completely misinterpreting right now?
Oh, man.
What warnings are we cheerfully ignoring simply because we've lost the original audience's perspective?
It really makes you wonder.
Yeah.
The next time you are handed a comfortable metaphor like a beautiful tree or a warm loaf of bread, you might want to look a little closer at the ingredients.
Because they might not be what they seem.
Because sometimes the most dangerous warnings are hidden in the most wholesome packages. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.